All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll get underway here. Thank you very much for coming today. Welcome to the Lubar Center at Eckstein Hall, Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today, we are joined by Michael Scott. He is the director of the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing. Michael Scott is a clinical professor at Arizona State University's School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. He is a former clinical professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is has a pretty interesting career. We were just talking about it a moment ago. In addition to being at ASU and being at UW-Madison, he's a former cop. He was on the Madison Police Department for 4 years. In addition to that, he has been a former police chief in Lauderhill, Florida, a suburb of Fort Lauderdale, where you said you got to start your own police department, which is kind of interesting. He's also been a civilian administrator with other departments, St. Louis Metro, New York City, Fort Pierce, Florida. He's got a very distinguished resume, we would say, and we are delighted to have him here today. And I also want to say a special thank you to the Community Coalition for Quality Policing, which has helped bring Professor Scott here for the next 2 days. So won't you please give Michael Scott a warm welcome to Marquette Law School. Good to have you with us today.
Always good to get the applause up front.
I'm sure there'll be more to come.
We'll see how it goes.
In the hour. Let's talk a little bit about problem-oriented policing and help people in this room understand specifically what you're talking about.
Okay, well, this is an idea that actually it's now one of the big ideas in policing internationally. And it actually has its origins just up the road in Madison at the University of Wisconsin Law School. My mentor and a professor who's now retired, Herman Goldstein. Wisconsin Law School got him out of the Chicago Police Department, and he had worked with one of the preeminent police chiefs in the history of American policing, O.W. Wilson, and he learned a great deal about, he was brought into Chicago to reform the Chicago Police Department. Work still in progress. That was in the early 1960s. Among the insights that Herman had about policing as he watched it unfold on the streets was that the police were not as effective as they could be. And he also had this observation that there seemed to be this implicit assumption that there was just sort of one way to police, and having officers out on patrol, handling calls, investigating crimes and cases one at a time would somehow result in effective policing and safer cities. And yet it wasn't necessarily. And this became really apparent in the 1970s, 1980s, when crime rates were at all-time highs and relationships between police and especially minority communities were, if you can imagine, even worse than they are today. And so he knew that there was something fundamentally amiss about how policing was done. And he proposed a new approach, a different way of dealing with policing. And in 1979, he published an article titled Improving Policing, a Problem-Oriented Approach, which he subsequently expanded into a fuller-blown book after some experimentation. The basic essence of this idea is that for police to be effective, they have to go beyond handling one crime, one case, one incident at a time, and begin to step back from and to look at the patterns and the trends and the commonalities among these crimes and incidents, to recognize that there are underlying problems that are begging for attention, and to analyze those problems, whether it's a problem related to robberies on the street, barking dogs, gang-related homicides, theft from stores. The analysis of those problems is really designed to ask fundamental questions about not just who did it, where did it happen, when did it happen, the basics of criminal investigation, but to ask the more probing question, why is this happening? Why is this happening and continuing to happen? Why is it worse in this place than it is in this place? Why is it worse for these people than for these people? And it's that search for causation and underlying conditions where he argued that the police have the greatest potential to be effective in addressing those underlying conditions and causes. Now, interestingly, the more the police do that, the more they come to realize that they, the police, don't control all of those underlying conditions and causes. And that's an important insight because it then means if we want to be effective in not only reacting to these bad things that happen, but preventing them, the police are going to need the support, the cooperation, the collaboration of other people outside the police department and outside even the criminal justice system. And another major insight that he came to after many years of study is that he felt that the police had come to over-rely, over-depend on the criminal justice system as the solution to all of the work that the public expects of the police. And he said that is ultimately a doomed strategy. The criminal justice system, important as it is not designed to deal with all of the business that we ask our police to deal with. And so we're going to have to give the police additional access to other systems, not just the criminal justice system, in order to be more effective.
I'd like to follow up on that. It's an interesting point. I've heard Chief Flynn, our police chief here, talk about the responsibilities of a police officer today. And the chief says that, at times we're social workers, at times we're mental health experts, at times we're required to be all these different things. It makes it very hard to be a police officer these days. Is that part of the challenge that you face when you're trying to deal with the conditions that create the problems?
It is. The popular view or understanding of the police is, well, they fight crime. What crimes? Well, if you listen to the FBI, they'll tell us there are 8 crimes that are important. These are called the Uniform Crime Reports Part 1 Index Crimes: murder, rape, robbery, sexual assault, auto theft, arson, a couple of others, burglary, larceny. Well, about 15 years ago, I started writing down a list, just a list of all of the different kinds of calls, investigations, problems that I knew police dealt with routinely. My list is, I don't think it will ever be complete, but it is currently at about 250 different problems. 250, not 8. And they're quite varied. And it's an awful lot of stuff that we ask our police. We pick up the phone, call 911 or 311 and say, hey, I need a police officer here to help me with X. It's a lot of stuff. And accordingly, the business of policing is really much more complicated, much more complex than the popular impression of it and the Hollywood image of it is.
How much of the success of problem-oriented policing is related to the acceptance by the community and also the acceptance by police officers, whether or not they believe in this concept? Can you address those points? Because I would assume that is crucial to whether or not this is going to be successful.
Well, it's crucial. I don't get hung up on, does everybody understand the terminology? That's helpful. But does everybody, the community and the police alike, need to accept the fact that the police mandate is pretty broad? It's big. It's not unlimited. We don't ask police to do everything, but we ask them to do an awful lot. And so, and we have to accept the fact that the police cannot achieve their mission by themselves. Not possible. And to the extent we try to get them to do it by themselves, where we think, well, we could solve every problem if police just arrested enough offenders, put them in jail, that's doomed to failure. So for the police to understand this, they have to come into the job and recognize, okay, we are an important player in this process of public safety. We're the first line. We're the ones that people call. When you don't know who else to call, you call the cops. Right? But what we need to do is get better at diagnosing the nature of these problems, and then to the extent that it's appropriate, engage other entities, whether private citizens, corporations, businesses, other government agencies, other criminal justice agencies, engage them as appropriate in dealing with that particular problem. And how we might do that is going to vary from problem to problem. But what we ought to be looking to do is really to develop, again, interventions that address the underlying conditions that are driving these particular problems.
Regarding underlying conditions, I look at a place like Milwaukee, for instance, but you could say this about St. Louis or Chicago or Baltimore or a number of cities around the country where you have concentrated poverty and intergenerational poverty and despair, a condition that has existed for a long time. Isn't it sort of beyond the realm of our expectations that police could somehow address such deep-rooted social issues?
Yeah, I think it is. That's kind of the tension in this concept is we want to encourage the police to look deeper for causation, but in some ways not too deep, because there's precious little the police can do by themselves in eradicating poverty, racism, inequitable distribution of wealth, psychopathology, substance abuse. You know, these are the things that we think of as root causes of crime and disorder. But that's not to say that police can't play an important role in raising those issues in the consciousness of a community. Police have been doing this for many, many years, dealing with mentally ill people on the street who are in moments of crisis. This was a good portion of what I did up in Madison, a good portion of what your Milwaukee officers do all the time. Right? Now, the police are not going to be trained. I received excellent training in recognizing signs and symptoms of different mental disorders and learning how to approach and talk to somebody who's mentally ill. But I was not expected, nor should I have been, to treat the mental illness. But I could be the one to bring that person into the mental health system to get them the help that they need. And then at an administrative level, it was my chief's job to make sure that the mental health agencies that are out there have capacity and are available to the police. In the good old days, back in Madison, we had a wonderful system. It really worked well. I could get a mental health worker out onto the street working with me in a moment of crisis. Right? There is a major issue in Wisconsin and all over the country today. The resources for that mental health treatment are not what they used to be. Right? And so it defaults to the police to still have to deal with people who are in moments of crisis. Police will not be able to solve that alone, but they play an important role in sort of raising the alarm in society to say, hey, this is a root cause, an underlying condition that needs attention. And that could extend to poverty. It certainly could extend to racism. It could extend to substance abuse and other things. So we can't expect the police to fix all those things, but we can expect them to understand how they're contributing to problems and to sound the alarm.
The Milwaukee Police Department, Chief Flynn says, we use problem-oriented policing. Is that the most common concept being used by major urban police departments around the country today?
I don't know that I have a way of quantifying that. In the United States especially, it's a big, messy policing system that we have. We're not even 100% sure we know how many police departments we have. At any time, they pop into existence and go out of existence. We think it's about 18,000. What are they all doing at any time? I don't know anybody who knows that. But problem-oriented policing is at least one of these ideas. I told you it was launched in 1979. It's one of the few ideas that here we are in almost, 40 years on, and it's still around. It's still one of the underlying ideas. There have been a lot of other ideas in policing. You maybe have heard some of these: broken windows policing and community policing and predictive policing and hotspots policing. I give you more and more of them. Many of them really sort of were born out of the problem-oriented approach. There are variations on it, honing in on particular aspects of it, emphasizing different particular aspects. But the problem-oriented approach is pretty fundamental and pretty comprehensive. And I think we will be coming back to it in one way or another as long as we're doing policing.
I want to ask you, you mentioned broken windows. So this is this philosophy or theory or concept by George Kelling, who says that, police need to be aggressive in terms of citing people for smaller offenses, because if you can tamp down on that eventually, and I hope I'm doing a decent job of explaining this, if you tamp down on that, you can eventually have an impact on larger crime issues in a community. The policing you're talking about, though, is different. It's less reliant on the criminal justice system as being this sort of enforcer that we're going to use, as the hammer to get people to conform to societal expectations. I'd like to have you talk about the difference in between something like broken windows approach and what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, to be fair to Professor Kelling and Professor Wilson, who came up with the concept, if you go back and actually read their original article, which was published in Atlantic Monthly magazine in 1982, really about the same time Goldstein was publishing on problem-oriented policing, what they really said was different than what's been interpreted, what we think of broken windows policing today. They really were emphasizing the role that a beat police officer has in getting to know a community, to know what the norms of the community are, and to help the community enforce its norms, and not always through criminal arrest. Over the years, especially when it's sort of blended with the New York City model of policing of the 1990s, it turned into what became known as zero-tolerance policing. And this is where the aggressiveness, the crackdown, let's lock them all up, let's take everybody to jail, every petty offense is going to be treated more seriously. That was really a distortion of what Wilson and Kelling were talking about originally, but that became the definition and how it was understood in a lot of places. And again, as you can imagine, if that's the interpretation, it's really re-emphasizing the criminal justice system as the solution of the problems. Goldstein and others say, wait a minute, wait a minute. That's exactly what I told you not to do. It's, again, an over-reliance on punishment, on criminal process as the solution to problems. And it's had, fairly predictably, some disastrous effects, especially on police-minority community relations in many cities.
You said we're doomed if we follow this path where we believe that the criminal justice system can deal with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, those here who were trained in law, trained especially in the practice of criminal law, you know that the proper practice of criminal law with due process and attention not only to truth finding, but to fairness and to protecting civil liberties and all of that. It's a delicate kind of process. Each case deserves time and attention to make sure that we treat defendants fairly, that we treat victims fairly. When you dump massive numbers of cases into that system, it can't handle it. It just cannot handle it, it cannot give each case the due process that we think will be necessary. And so, not surprisingly, we find that probably in the neighborhood of 95% of all prosecutions are resolved through a plea agreement, not through a trial. Now, this is not Hollywood. Trials are pretty rare things. And it becomes very assembly line justice, and it's a bit of let's make a deal, and we work these things out quickly, and so there's lots of room for error. And as you can imagine, what would a criminal prosecution do for a mentally ill defendant? I mean, somebody's going to have to explain that to me. How is that going to make putting somebody who's mentally ill in prison, how's it going to make them better? And if anything, if you know anything about mental disorder, it's probably going to make them worse. Right? If they're addicted to heroin, cocaine, how is putting them in prison going to fix that? So the criminal justice system was designed for, a relatively few number of instances and people who need to be kept secure away from society for our protection. or whose behavior was so egregious it just merits that kind of punishment. But it does not do high volume well.
How would you describe, you just mentioned the sort of the relationship between community and police today. How would you describe that relationship?
Ooh. Well, I say you'd have to go back to the 1960s, mid-60s to mid-70s to find worse times. I don't think they're quite as bad as they were back then, but you know, who's to know? That could be the case in some cities. For the most part, police have enjoyed general support and respect from most citizens. But when you break that down by race and ethnicity, you do find some pretty stark differences. Counter to popular opinion, even in minority communities, African American, Latino communities, the surveys typically show that the majority of people among those groups still support, trust, respect the police, but it's at significantly lower rates than do white Americans. So there's a big difference. And this will vary. This also varies from community to community. Again, it's important to remember we do not have a national policing system. It's not a national police. There is no such thing as the American police. There are local police, and that's who we know. And that's who we either have a good relationship with our local police or we have a lousy relationship. And the federal government, there's no power in the federal government to make that uniform across the entire country. But there is clearly work to be done, as there was in the early 1970s, for the police to, step back and reconsider what is the nature of that relationship that we have, especially in minority communities. And how can we restore that? Now, while the problem-oriented approach to policing was not designed explicitly to improve those relationships, it very much had them in mind. And that's why this over-reliance on the criminal justice system is a core aspect of why we have strained relations between police and especially minority communities. Trying to solve very difficult problems with a sledgehammer.
You've been a police chief in a community that had a fairly significant number of minorities in the community.
Yes.
Tell me how you would build, if you were a chief today, how would you build and improve on the relationship between community and police department?
Well, one of the things I'm trying to simplify a complex idea. In the first reaction after the massive rioting of the late 1960s, early 70s, when we sort of forget this, 57 American cities, by one count, went up in flames in massive race riots. Many of them, most of them probably really instigated by some police action that led to the rioting. In the wake of that, the main approach was an approach that was called police-community relations. And police departments began hiring specialists. I remember in Madison, they hired a civilian police-community relations specialist. And the idea was, well, we'll send a few of these specialists out into the Black and Latino neighborhoods, and they will make nice. They will explain what police are doing and listen, but the rest of the cops will just continue to do what they always do. And we sort of imagined that a few people making nice would cure all ills. Well, it didn't. And so I like to say today that in minority communities, when you go in and you just talk to people, you say, well, what do you want? They want the same things they do in majority communities. They want safe, secure communities where they don't have to worry about crime all the time. They don't have to worry about their children's safety and all. They want the same things. And so I often say to the police, it's not enough for you to stop doing bad things in minority communities. You also have to do good things. You've got to be of help. You've got to help make those neighborhoods and those communities safe and secure. And the most effective way that we know to do that is really problem by problem, analyze it, figure it out, go try to deal with the underlying conditions and causes. It can work. And turns out that where police are able to do that, minority communities, like majority communities, appreciate it. And the officers, in turn, appreciate being appreciated. You know, police officers don't enjoy being hated. They know that there's part of their job that will alienate people, but they like to be able to say, I went into that community and I helped people. I made it a safer community. So there is a connection here between the problem-oriented approach and police-minority community relations that sometimes isn't obvious.
Is this moment of tension that exists today, is this a cumulative effect of years, or has it been the result of these highly publicized officer-involved shootings that we see video of? Is it something that's just gradually came to this level, or is it something that was precipitated by other things?
Well, I'd say this was true in the 60s as it is true today, is riots. They may be sparked by an incident. That doesn't mean that was the cause. And it usually is sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, an expression of frustration and anger of usually decades, if not generations, of resentment and hostility in strained relations. And so I've had a few police chiefs over the years comment, those who have gone and worked as chiefs in different cities, where they've had similar kinds of controversial shootings in police. In some cities, that was guaranteed to erupt into a riot. In other cities, the same fact pattern, and it wouldn't. And the difference is to be found in the long-term history, not just in that split-second decision-making. So, yeah, this is, trust is both earned and lost over the long term.
Is there a department around the country that you know of, Professor Scott, that is doing problem-oriented policing really well right now? Really has its act together on that?
Oh, at any time over the past 40 years, I could have pointed to different departments. It sort of waxes and wanes. It's heavily a product of the leadership of the department at the time, where they want to go. But yeah, in current years, I see consistently good work out of the Portland, Oregon Police Department, the Arlington, Texas Police Department, the Houston Police Department, the Sheboygan Police Department, La Crosse, a good number here in Wisconsin. And I am pleased to say there's some very good work that's being done by the Milwaukee Police Department. Are there any departments where it is as institutionalized, as routine as I would like to see? Not many. And so...
Why is that?
It's hard. It's harder work. There is this basic model of policing that we fell into, which is sometimes called the professional model of policing, which says to a patrol officer, your job, and I did it, get in your squad car at the beginning of the shift, drive around, look for trouble, wait for the radio to tell you that there's trouble at some place, go to that trouble, write a report about that trouble, catch a bad guy if you can, write your report and go back in service and repeat and do that over again. There's a simplicity in it. I'm not saying it's easy, but there's a routine to it. And after a while, any police officer can become sort of comfortable with that. And in a police department, the management of that process. If I'm a patrol commander, I just make sure and all the cops that are supposed to show up for duty, they showed up. Got enough cars for them? Got enough cars. Put them in the cars, get them out there. Then wait for the phone to ring. And then we go and we do this stuff. We got a system. And it's relatively easy. When you do this problem-oriented policing, and you go instead and say, well, I'm not just going to drive around today. I'm going to go to this community meeting, I'm going to sit down with these people, and I'm going to ask them, hey, what's going on in the neighborhood? What are the problems? And they describe to me something that's, well, man, that's kind of complex. This park is not safe anymore. Well, I can't just write a ticket, I can't just put one person in jail and the park is safe again. I've got to go collect data, I've got to analyze it, I've got to talk to people, I've got to figure out why is this park not safe anymore. And what I do to make this park safe is probably not in a There's no cookie cutter approach. It might be different than what I'd have to do for a different park in the city. So it doesn't lend itself to as routinized a policing process as does the other model. And I would say, well, if policing is complex, it's going to demand some complexity in responding to the problems. And that's just hard to do. I will also say that, again, oftentimes when the police put this effort in and say, well, I've analyzed the problem, I think this is really what's driving it, but I need help. I need some other agency, the community, some business to start doing something or stop doing something that's causing this problem. A lot of times that other agency, that company, that community might say, no, we'd rather not. We'd rather not. And then the police have to say, yeah, but we need you to. We really need you to. And so this is an aspect of policing that sometimes the cooperation that police need requires a little bit of oomph behind it, a little bit of, this really needs to happen. I've cited this example a couple of times, but here in Milwaukee, like lots of cities, and over the past couple of decades, you've got a problem with people who steal scrap metal. Sometimes not even scrap. I first heard about this in the late 80s in Milwaukee. People were getting their screen doors stolen off their house and the aluminum sidings stolen off the house. What the heck? Well, you could imagine, why would a thief steal your aluminum door? Because they can take it down the street and sell it, right? And there's a scrapyard that will buy it. And as the price of aluminum goes up, it becomes a... So eventually, in Milwaukee police, this was one of the problems that they analyzed a few years ago with some of my law students' help. And they realized there really aren't that many places in Milwaukee that'll buy a stolen beer keg or a stolen screen door or a piece of railroad track. But there are probably about a dozen or so places that will. Now, there's a choice for the Milwaukee police. You want to tell your officers to go chasing around after all these possible thieves, trying to catch everybody stealing metal? Or you want to go to these scrap yards and say, hey, you need to stop buying stolen metal? Now, they might say to the police, hey, mind your own business. It's my business. I'll decide what I buy. Well, in Milwaukee, and the state legislature has said it, no, that's not acceptable. You're a business and you're contributing to a crime problem. You need to insist on identification, you need to insist on some proof of ownership of it, you've got to keep some records, you've got to be open to inspection, like lots of businesses. And there is the answer to your scrap metal problem, is to be found in that. But that, again, some of the business community might say, well, hey, don't blame us, blame the guy who stole the metal. Now, we could have a debate. Who's to blame? We might not all agree on that, but we ought to at least have that conversation. And that same sort of dynamic plays out in most of the problems that police are dealing with.
I was going to ask you about sort of one of the challenges that police officers have, and that is, do they have the training? Are they getting the training? Are they getting the teaching that's necessary to be able to approach things differently than perhaps they have in the past, to analyze problems on the spot, to look at them differently? Are they getting adequate training for that type of policing approach?
Well, I can't tell you what the Milwaukee Police Academy is doing today. I have helped the Milwaukee Police Academy develop that capacity to train its officers in doing that. They need that training. It doesn't have to be, we're not really necessarily talking about turning every police officer into a sociologist or a criminologist. They don't need that level of skill in data analysis and in crime theory and all of that, but they need some of it. Need enough of it to be able to ask good questions. When you do this investigation, when you take this report, start asking the questions. Why is this happening? Who's responsible for this? Where could I get the information, the data? And so we'd like it, and ideally, they could go back to the station house and pull up on the computer and say, well, I could pull up some data. Or if that would take too much time, we have some crime analysts who are paid, that's their job. Milwaukee PD does have some. They're specially trained in that, so they could help the officers with that analysis. It doesn't have to be, all of this responsibility is, we're not just dumping it on the lone police officer on the street. We need the entire agency and really the entire city government poised to be able to engage in that and to help with that process.
I don't want to wade too far into politics, but I did want to ask you about your statement that we're doomed to fail if we rely on the criminal justice system for everything. And yet I think in the new administration there is a feeling that, you know, cops and law enforcement need to get tougher. We need to get tougher out there. What will be the impact from your perspective?
I would say be careful what you wish for. You want tough cops? We've shown police can show what toughness looks like, and it is not always pretty. And it's not always effective. It would be one thing if we could say, well, yeah, if we really got draconian and had officers stopping anybody at any time for any reason and searching them and searching their homes and confiscating their contraband and their stuff they shouldn't have and citing them for every violation. Well, that might mean you too. It means everybody, so we just ratchet that up. Could we get more safety in society? I don't think it's an experiment any of us really want to have. Right? That's not the American society that we created. And we got to remember, we created this society before we created police. You know, we didn't create police departments in the United States till the 1840s, and we had a country running for a good while before that. So we didn't really, these civil liberties are pretty important to us. And again, the evidence is just not all that strong that intensive law enforcement in and of itself is going to lead to the kind of safety that we're looking for. You know, if you look at the crack cocaine epidemic that we were sort of, thank goodness, phasing out of, only to inherit an opioid epidemic, but you look at the responses that we made to it in policing. Nobody can say police didn't lock up people. We filled up the prisons to historic, levels, mainly with drug offenders and those who were committing crimes in furtherance of the drug markets. You know, we did in every police department I worked in, and it was always somehow every place I went had the highest homicide rates as soon as I got there. I'm not taking responsibility for that, but and the success that police did eventually have in reducing the harm from crack cocaine dealing and trafficking has come not so much from criminal law enforcement as from improved property management and really getting the owners better management of the locations in which the drug markets were operating. Now, the problem is morphed, so drugs aren't bought and sold in the same way they used to be. It used to be you had to go down to the corner to get your drugs, and you had to do a hand-to-hand exchange with the drug dealer. Today, the deals are made over a cell phone, and it's just a different animal. But that's what I mean, that we now in fact have some evidence that pure lock 'em up and throw away the key approaches to very prevalent kinds of problems is not proven very effective and has done some pretty considerable harm to the social fabric of a lot of communities.
I'm going to open it up to audience questions here. This is my final question. So you're in town for a number of different meetings. You're going to hear from members of the community. I think there's a feeling on the part of some in this community that the relationship between the community and police could be significantly better than it is today. Are we atypical? Are we unusual here in Milwaukee, or
not at all?
Is this
not at all? No, I don't think so. Again, this experience of police and minority communities, it's not a national phenomenon. There are national dimensions to it. The media coverage of it is oftentimes national, but the real feelings, the real experiences are all local. They're all local. I don't hold out any particular city in this country and say this is the shining city on the hill where they have absolutely beautiful, harmonious relations between police and minority communities. But there are places where it's better and places where it's worse. Right? And, I've had some recent experiences working with and talking with not only police in Cincinnati, Ohio, but also community activists who were really critical of the police. And alike, while they don't claim their city is perfect, they do say that things are a whole lot better than they were 15, 20 years ago, in which their city erupted into riots that were really aimed at just frustration and anger at the way in which police were treating especially young African-American men. And that has improved, and to hear that come out of the mouth of the people who filed the lawsuits against the police department is a profound testimonial. How did they do it? Well, they really made the problem-oriented approach to policing the central aspect of how they were going to go about changing the way police services were delivered on the street. That wasn't the only thing they did, but that was a big part of it.
Let's take some questions from the audience. For those of you who have been here in the past, if you're in the seating bowl, you press down on the rim, not on the ball, but keep your finger down on the rim. We'll be able to hear your question. If you're in the back, please raise your hand. Ryan has a microphone. Ask your question. He'll hang on to the microphone. Just ask it briefly, and we'll get to as many as possible. So I'm going to start up in the back, and then we'll move down to the front, and we'll start right here.
Hello, thank you so very much for coming. I'm the mother of Dontre Hamilton, who was murdered by a Milwaukee police officer. My question to you relates to management, the people who actually send the police out, make the decisions, policies and procedures. What and how can they actually deal with the mental illness and management of policing in these different police departments? Because it's a triple down effect by management who are sending these police officers out in the streets. So if this being approved by their sergeants and the chiefs, how can the community actually communicate with them when it's a no-win inside management?
Yeah. This again is one of the most challenging problems that police have to deal with, is that encounter between a mentally ill person and the police. And we know that it's important to, from the day they join the police academy, for officers to be trained to recognize first that this is going to happen. You're going to deal with people who are not in their right mind, and to at least have some basic understanding of signs, symptoms of the most common kinds of disorders that are likely to lead to a police encounter, which would include schizophrenia, and to then learn some techniques for communicating with people who may not be hearing, processing information in the way that somebody who is not mentally ill would. To learn how to talk to them, to learn how to approach them. And then again, as I said, to understand the laws, Chapter 51 in the state of Wisconsin, on involuntary commitment of mentally ill people, but then to also understand the procedures if you really think this person is mentally ill, to know what to do in terms of getting that person to a mental health professional, and if necessary, how to initiate a mental health treatment and involuntary commitment. If we did that perfectly, would that guarantee we would never have a deadly encounter between policing a mentally ill person? No. Would it reduce the risk? Yes. But all of those things implicate police management in deciding this needs to be in the training, deciding what equipment the officers carry, deciding how they're taught to communicate, deciding what they know about the law, in understanding the procedures. But there's also that ingredient that the police don't control, which is the capacity of the mental health system to be there when the police need them. So, but the police at least have an obligation to, again, sound the alarm to say, if there is an adequate capacity, there needs to be. There needs to be.
Other questions? Yes. No, right, no, right. Yeah, go ahead.
I know that police departments evaluate police officers every 6 months, every year or so. And often that involves how well they do reports, the number of tickets they write, the number of crimes they evaluate or process, or people that are arrested. Do you see that police departments do, or should they do a better job in evaluating police officers in regard to problem solving? Should they be evaluated and assessed and rewarded in regard to that? Is that the type of philosophy that would work within a department of helping to instill a belief that problem-oriented policing and problem solving might be a better way to resolve these issues?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. What you were describing is what we sometimes call is just bean counting. Bean counting, how many tickets did you write, how many arrests did you make, how many cases did you investigate, how many meetings did you go to, how many calls did you handle. There is some value in that, I guess, from a management standpoint, not much that I can see. Right? I mean, what does it imply? The officer who writes the most tickets wins? You know, what do they win? The officer who makes the most arrests is the best cop? Well, you know, if you believe that that's all the police exist to do is to arrest people, then maybe, but that isn't. It isn't what the police exist to do, just to arrest people. So more is not necessarily better. You can imagine an officer, and I've worked with some, they write hundreds of tickets a year. I mean, they just love it. They'll write 20 a shift. And I said, gee, how's that working for community relations? The single easiest way to alienate a citizen is hand them a citation. Doesn't mean they don't deserve it sometimes, but you know, warnings go a long way, important. So to your point, yeah, could we evaluate an officer for, well, how many community problems did you identify? How well did you do analyzing them? How effective were you in responding to them? To some extent, how effective were you in dealing with it without having to put lots of people in jail and use a lot of force? That's the way we ought to be thinking about performance evaluation.
Take other questions. Yes, right there.
Hi, I'm with an organization called Disability Rights Wisconsin, and I work with youth. And we often see that intersection of youth and in schools through their school resource officers in what we call the school to prison pipeline. And we see children with disabilities and African American children being subjected to arrest at early ages. How do you think the problem-oriented policing can improve that? And one of the things we hear often is officers are just assigned to a school. They're not really trained to deal with juveniles. And we know this leads to incarceration later in life.
Good question. When I was working in the St. Louis Police Department, there was a funding opportunity to start something with cops in schools. So I grabbed onto that, so we ought to get some of that money. We're going to create, at that time, one of the earlier school officer programs. And I had to think about how would we design it. And one of the things that, because I wanted to promote the problem-oriented policing in the department, I said, well, let's just make these problem-oriented police officers who are working not just in the school, but in the school and in 3 square blocks around the school. That was important because what I understood was some of the problems that are affecting the school children are things that are happening on the way to and from school, what's happening in the neighborhood around it. But one of the interesting dynamics we had is in sitting down with the principals of those schools, we had to be very adamant in saying to them, this is not your armed hall monitor, right? Now, this is where a lot of these school resource officer programs have gone off the rails and has contributed to the school to prison pipeline, is when the officer says, well, my job is to enforce the law here in the school. Well, somebody had to tell the officer that was the job. They didn't make it up. So you want to be careful. If that's how you define the job, don't be surprised. But most of us would agree, come on, criminal law enforcement ought to be a last resort in a school. Right? So your job ought to be there in a different capacity. I'm not really wild about just putting the cops in classrooms and giving lectures. That's a different approach. But it's the officer who says, are there any safety problems in and around this school? Right? That's what they need me for, is to help address those safety problems so that the teachers can teach and the students can learn. That's it. That's what we need the officer for. And that would help to mitigate against that reflexive, okay, you sassed a teacher, you're here are the handcuffs, you're going to jail. Right? Right? It can easily devolve into that if that's what the expectations are.
Let me take other questions. I'll go over here. Yes, sir.
I was curious if you think that getting police out of squad cars and having people walk beats like in the old days would do a lot more to improve people understanding what the problems are by just having conversations with people unexpectedly walking the beat.
I would say maybe, but not necessarily. In New York City, we used to have what we just call foot posts. So you assign a cop a foot post, and your foot post is maybe 1 or 2 blocks in Midtown Manhattan on this side of the street. And we'd say, but you don't cross the street. You're on this side of the street, and you're to be walking up and down. And a sergeant would come once in a while and make sure you were on that block. Hey, I came by, you weren't there. But you get in trouble if you were talking to too many people. I mean, the idea was, sure, it's foot patrol, but it's really sort of, it's like the scarecrow in the cornfield. It's just, that's it. Well, that's a very different model. My point is, I don't much care how police officers get around. Foot, horse, car, donkey, what difference does it make to a great extent? I mean, there are some. The important part is the getting out, the talking to people, and most importantly, to finding out, hey, what are the public safety problems for which I could be helpful? That's the point of it. It's not just to make nice. Make nice is nice, sure it is. But it's to serve a purpose, to accomplish a police objective, to help make a neighborhood safer. However you do that, and we've proven it can be done by any mode of transportation. Maybe not helicopter.
Other question, yes. Yeah, just keep your finger down, yeah. Mm-hmm. You're good.
Oh, okay. Getting back to Mrs. Hamilton's question about mental health and so forth, when the law was changed in, 1976, the Alberta
Lazard
decision, Chapter 51, you used to be able to have an individual committed if the family thought that they needed some mental health services and so forth. With that law, you could only hold them for 72 hours. So the police and the family were both in, how could either of them help a person that needed help? What are the chances of that law being revisited and perhaps changing in some way so that individuals can get some treatment? Because now, unless they're a threat to themselves or others, you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And therefore, that led to the whole homeless situation, the group home situation that kind of floundered because nobody wanted a group home in their area, so that went out. And then the mental health people thought, well, we can give them medication and then they can stay in the group homes. That didn't work so well either because there was so many reactions to the medication. They didn't take it, they spit it out and all of that. So we're really back to ground nowhere. How can that be resolved?
You're asking a really profound question and a really important one. And I would say we need to continue this conversation. Appropriately, the law is trying to balance the individual rights that even a mentally ill person has, against their need for treatment, but also taking into consideration the public safety. And one could argue that the law has tipped the scale in favor of the mentally ill person's individual rights not to be confined. Most of us would say we're all individuals. We like the benefit of that law too, but it has its consequences. And it does mean that, because I did plenty of those emergency commitments, proving the imminent dangerousness to self or another is the harder part very often. You know, they get the mental health professionals say, yes, this person's mentally ill, but that alone doesn't get them into involuntary treatment. They have to be imminently dangerous. And that can sometimes be difficult to establish. It's a conversation that has to be had in the psychiatric community with the legislators and with judges who are going to ultimately rule on the constitutionality of these things. My own personal view is I think we have, to the detriment of many mentally ill people, have sometimes erred on the side of not providing them the involuntary treatment that they need. The nature of some mental illnesses is they're not going to, when they are mentally ill, they're not going to agree to the treatment that they might need. But very hard question.
Got time for a couple of quick questions here. We'll take one and then we'll go back there, yes. Mm-hmm. Just on the rim, yeah, there you go.
My question is regarding the pay structure. When you talked about the Houston and Portland that are better at this type of policing, I question whether or not their pay structure rewarded them for using this type of policing, or if we don't pay police for what we want to see them do, then it's just going to become another flavor of the month, in my impression, in my opinion, of whether or not, you know, I do community-based policing, we do hotspot policing, and that's what you're paying them for. Then we're not going to get the other type of policing we're looking for.
Yeah.
So did those police departments use a reward system that rewarded that particular type of policing?
It really is a very good question, and I'm going to say I agree with you in part and disagree in part, in that, to my knowledge, no, they didn't. In my experience, two things are true. You pay your police officers well, and the main thing that's going to get for you is higher caliber police officers and people to apply to become police officers. That's what you want, just good minds. Good minds, good hearts, good people who say, that's a job, it's a good job, pays well, and I'd like to do that. You want those people. Once you get them, I'm convinced you can't buy initiative and you can't buy creativity. And that's much of what we need in the problem-oriented policing. Dangling some money in front of an officer, hey, if you solve a problem, here's $100, you know. It's not going to work. It's going to lead to a lot of gamesmanship. It's going to lead to sort of bogus problem solving just to get the reward money. It doesn't turn out to be the incentive to do it. What we have found is that recognition for good work is far more powerful. And that's free. And that recognition can come from the community, from your supervisor, from the department. Say, hey, you're a good cop. That was good work.
This will be the final question, RL. Go ahead. Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm curious to know, are there examples of crime reductions associated with problem-oriented policing? And if so, what are those percentage reductions?
Yeah, I can't say this whole business of saying what leads crime to drop nationwide is kind of futile. We don't have good enough measurement systems. What I often say with the problem-oriented policing is you measure the effectiveness and the reductions in the problem, one problem at a time. All right. Now, crime will go up and down in society, in cities and communities, heavily depending on a range of factors that police don't directly control. But can police apply problem-oriented policing in a targeted, purposeful way to reduce serious crime? Yes. Nice example, and one that got a lot of attention, but deservedly so, was work that the city of Boston and the Boston police did in the late 1990s when youth gang-related homicides of youth were at an all-time high. And with some assistance from researchers at Harvard, they worked with the Boston police, really analyzed that problem carefully, and came up with some core insights about the nature of gang-related and gun-related violence in Boston that has now had a profound effect on rethinking how we deal with that problem across the country. It led to an insight that it was really a relatively small number of individuals in Boston who were the driving force behind the serious gun violence. That even most of the young people who were carrying guns were not the serious threats, they were mostly carrying guns for their own personal protection, or afraid of a relatively few number of leaders of gangs. And so police said, we don't need to roust all of the young men of the city in order to get the reductions in the violence that we need. We need to get the attention of those who are really driving the problem. And that led to an approach that's called focused deterrence. It's a much more tailored approach, and it really is intended to provide meaningful, credible threats of punishment and incarceration for these offenders, but simultaneously offering them a great deal of social support if they're willing to knock it off and willing to stop the violence. And it's been replicated in a good number of cities around the country, including Cincinnati, and where it's done well. That approach, which is a much more targeted and limited use of the criminal justice system, has led to some fairly significant reductions in the worst form of violence that we know.
Sheldon, you had a final question?
I guess that doesn't work too well.
We'll make sure we do. Ryan's got it. Yeah, we got it.
It seems to me, with Michael, what I've heard you say, there's kind of two kind of criminals. I mean, the lawbreakers. I mean, those that are kind of peaceful, but they park their car or speed or something. And those that are that are involved in criminal gangs and guns. In the Old West, we called the first type peace officers. Do you think we would make some progress if we would have peace officers, the ones that are on the street or a bicycle, and are really there to help people? And they'd be known as not tough guys, but there to help you. And that you would have the criminal section, I mean, bank robbers, of which we don't seem to have too many these days, who would have this other group of people. But to get the people that have been referred to here, that have mental problems or whatever, that they would be in the province of the peace officer.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question and proposition, raises a lot of important, you're partly right that offenders are, not just of two types, but two sort of, to simplify, two basic types. A relatively small number who are pretty deeply committed to being bad guys. And they're mean, they're vicious, they're violent, they're determined. The vast majority of offenders are what we would call opportunistic. They're kind of lazy. If they could steal something rather than earn it, they'll steal it. Make it harder to steal it, they won't steal it. Right? And so police need to understand the difference. But it also turns out with even some of those people, as I said in the Boston experience, that we believed were the absolute worst offenders, the most violent. It turned out even those people were capable, some of them, of changing their ways given the right set combination of incentives to do well and disincentives, threats of punishment. So when you then turn that on the police and say, well, how should the police sort of bifurcate, have the tough cops and the good cops? I don't really like that idea because I want the right policing for the right problem. And the toughest cops I know can be excellent problem solvers, and simultaneously some of the nicest cops can be really ineffective. So every cop is capable of this kind of work.
What I really wanted to ask you, and I thought it wasn't a good question, was what is your idea of the job description of the ideal